Hey, it's Dr. John Terry, the Black Belt Leader. Welcome to the Black Belt Leadership Podcast, where each week I'm giving you tips, tools, insights, and resources to help you become a better version of who you are and what you do as you discover, develop, and deploy your own Black Belt leader within. Hey, you've heard me say often that leadership and personal growth lessons can be found anywhere, and today's no exception. I want to take you into the world of Nickelodeon, to one of the most successful cartoon series that Nickelodeon has ever brought to the air. In fact, at the time of this recording, this cartoon series is about to go into its 20th season. I want to share a life lesson from SpongeBob SquarePants. Title of this week's lesson, Beware the Suds. So let me set it up with a backstory. 1984, Steven Hellenberg, creator of SpongeBob SquarePants. He wants to do something amazing with his degree that he just received in marine biology. So he joins the Ocean Institute with a goal to educate the public about marine life, marine science, and maritime history. While he was there, he utilized his creative artistic talent, something he'd been cultivating since childhood, to create a comic book called The Intertidal Zone. Goal of the comic, educate visiting students about sea life in tidal pools. Now, the announcer in the comic book introducing these sea characters to the reader was a lovable character, his name, Bob the Sponge. Now, the students that visited the Ocean Institute actually loved the comic, and they took it home and it became a great hit. So Hellenberg got this great idea. If the students love it, maybe a larger audience will love it. So he attempted multiple times to have that comic book professionally published. But every time he went to a publisher, the door was closed. So he gave up on the idea of taking Bob the Sponge beyond just a local attraction that would benefit the students visiting the Ocean Institute. But while attending an animation festival, Steven Hellenberg met an individual by the name of Joe Murray. If you don't know Joe Murray, he was the creator of Rocko's Modern Life, another very popular Nickelodeon cartoon series. Murray was so impressed, he offered Hellenberg a job. And after Murray learned about the comic book that Hellenberg had created, he encouraged him to think about creating a television series, a cartoon based upon his comic book heroes. So Hellenberg went back to his original cast of characters, but this time he wanted to do something a little different, to bring the comic book to a cartoon and not only reach the children, but to also reach the parents of the children. He wanted to rebrand the characters in an innovative way. So he recast Bob the Sponge as a kitchen sponge, seeking a relatable human connection with his young cartoon audience. I mean, think about it. In a child's imagination, a yellow square kitchen sponge could literally be anything. And that could include a nerdy character who lived in a pineapple at the bottom of the ocean. So, in the original drawings for this cartoon series, Bob the Sponge became Sponge Boy. But as they were moving through the process of developing the cartoon series, they discovered the name Sponge Boy was taken. Now, at this point in time, they had brought in Tom Kenny, who later became the voice of SpongeBob, and he was collaborating on the project. And while he was looking at the storyboards, he made an interesting observation. He said, "Boy, look at this sponge in square pants, thinking he's ever going to get a job in a fast food restaurant." Well, Steven Hillenburg loved the phrase, and he believed that that was going to reinforce the nerdiness of the character that he was developing. And it was in that moment SpongeBob SquarePants was born. And then soon other characters followed, again, thinking outside the box to bring human qualities to these diverse sea creatures. Mr. Krabs, that crusty, money-hungry crab running a fast food restaurant aptly named the Krusty Krab. And then there was Squidward, that obnoxious clarinet-playing squid who hated everyone and everything. And of course, there's Patrick Star, SpongeBob's best friend, his bumbling, fun-loving, knuckle-headed sidekick. And then there's Sandy Cheeks, the scientific squirrel genius who had chosen to live her life underseas to engage in scientific exploration. And let's not forget Plankton, the nemesis and competitor of Mr. Krabs. He runs the chum bucket. And of course, there's Gary's pet snail. That was SpongeBob's best friend. Now, all of these characters reside in an underwater city. That's right, an underwater city. Of course, it's sea creatures. That underwater city, Bikini Bottom. It's located at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean in the cartoon, literally beneath the real-life Bikini Atoll in the Marshall Islands. Now, if you're a history buff, you'll recognize the Marshall Islands is the home of the nuclear testing grounds during World War II. Now, interestingly, as a side note, many fans theorize that Hellenberg chose this site because of the nuclear testing that took place there. That resulted in the mutations that gave the sea creatures of Bikini Bottoms their unique human-like qualities. Whether that's true or not, we don't know, but it's one of the urban myths of SpongeBob SquarePants. Now let's pivot into the story and the message for today: beware the Suds. One of the most memorable episodes in season one was called The Suds. I remember my children were little when this came out, and this was actually a television episode they wanted to watch again and again and again. And my youngest, Jordan, even would go get the yellow sponge from the kitchen and would act out parts of the show, and you'll get why in just a minute. Now, in this particular episode, and it first aired January 17th, 2000, 25 years ago at the time of this recording, SpongeBob falls asleep after waking up in the middle of the night, realizing he's hungry. He goes to his refrigerator. He makes himself a peanut butter and jellyfish sandwich, and after taking one bite, immediately falls asleep, leaving the refrigerator door open overnight. Well, by morning, his entire house, again, it is a hollowed out pineapple. That entire house is frozen. And SpongeBob awakens with a case of the Suds. It's an illness that causes him to sneeze bubbles. Think kitchen sponge, full of Dawn dishwashing liquid, and now being water added to it, being squeezed and squeezed and squeezed. I think you get the idea. It's kind of messy. Well, undeterred, SpongeBob goes to work because he loves making Krabby Patties as the chief cook at the Krusty Krab. But there he began to sneeze over and over, and bubbles filling the kitchen, bubbles filling the dining room, and he was ultimately sent home by Mr. Krabs. So SpongeBob asks Sandy Squirrel to take him to the doctor, which is what Mr. Krabs had told him to do. But while he's waiting for Sandy to show up, Patrick Star stops by the house. And when Patrick finds out that SpongeBob is sick and about to go to the doctor, Patrick begins to vividly tell this third-party account of a friend of a friend of a friend who had visited the doctor's office. And as he told this story, it was something akin to someone having to be dragged into a torture chamber. Well, terrified by what Patrick had shared, SpongeBob asked Patrick to be his doctor. "Please don't let me go to the doctor's office," he said. "Can you fix me?" Well, Patrick decided he would play doctor, and his cure was to plug all of SpongeBob's holes with cork plugs. Sandy shows up and says, "SpongeBob, we've got to get you to the doctor." But Patrick says, "I've got this." He rebuked Sandy's urgings, and as you can guess, it got a lot worse from there. So now, as SpongeBob's going around sick with the Suds, every time he sneezes, he can't expel the excess soap bubbles in his body. So what happens? He swells larger and larger. He goes from yellow to purple to blue. And as you look at him, you can tell he's looking and feeling more miserable as the episode goes on. And things finally come to a head towards the middle of the episode when SpongeBob finally sneezes so hard, the corks erupt from his body, literally destroying the Krusty Krab restaurant in the process and drawing the ire of his boss, Mr. Krabs, who orders him to immediately go to the hospital and get treatment. So Sandy shows up and finally takes SpongeBob to see a real doctor who prescribes a sponge treatment. The doctor sends in Hans, a human hand, and he uses SpongeBob to clean a man's back and his feet, to wash the face of a dinner plate, to scrub the surface of a parked car, and to also scrub the tiles on the floor. And in doing so, he was able to remove all the soapy, sudsy residue from SpongeBob's body. As he scrubbed, we saw SpongeBob go from purple to blue and back to bright, shiny yellow color. And at the end of the day, SpongeBob was back to his happy, normal, smiling self. So the doctor sent SpongeBob home with a large lollipop, much to the envy of Patrick Star. So the episode ends with Patrick wanting his own lollipop, feigning his own version of the Suds. So the doctor's treatment, kind of in a bit of humorous karma, was to have Hans use Patrick to scrub a toilet and a cactus. And as the episode fades to black, Patrick can be seen shouting as the cleaning's taking place, "Wait, wait, this doesn't seem right." Well, you get the idea of the story of the Suds, and that sets up today's personal growth lesson. Got to remember, SpongeBob isn't the only person who can be infected with the Suds. That's right, you, me, we all can be affected with the Suds, and that can cause us to live far below our potential. So it begs the question, John, what are some real life suds that can infect our lives? Well, let's start with our own inner critic, that nagging little voice that hangs out between our ears, always telling us what we can't do. That nagging little voice can not only be harsh, at times, it can be incredibly judgmental. That nagging little voice, that inner critic constantly questions our abilities to say and do anything, and it challenges our self worth. That inner critic is constantly telling us what we can't do, what we can't become, and it's always reminding us of all the times we failed. That inner critic wants to hold us captive to the past and not allow us to get past the past and move forward. So this infection, this version of the suds, it seeks to leave us where we are, as we are, unchanged. And it evokes feelings of doubt, of fear, and an inferiority. Now, you got to go back to the cartoon episode to really get the idea of this. Patrick's well-meaning but misguided home remedies only made the problem worse. So it begs the question, how often do we do the very same thing? Rather than confront the fact that we're listening to an inner critic, we're listening to that nagging little voice that's lying to us, telling us what we can't do, rather than silencing that voice and reminding ourselves that we are more than capable, what do? We turn to a quick fix, or we go and we seek the guidance and advice of our own Patrick Star, someone who's totally unqualified to help us. You know, deep down, you and I, we know what we need to do, but for some reason, we won't do what must be done. And if we leave this uncorrected, it leads us to phase two of the infection of the suds, and that's comparison and contrast. Because when we're dealing with doubt, when we're dealing with fear, we're dealing with inferiority, it often leads us down a path that we start comparing and contrasting ourselves with other people. Well, I'm not as good as them, or I wished I could do this as well as them, or they can do this, but I can't. And when we get into this constant mode of comparing our achievements and our failures with those of others, what are we doing? We're fueling our inner critic. We're giving that nagging little voice in between our ears the fuel it needs to continue to amplify our perceived shortcomings rather than focusing and developing our unique strengths. And if we do that long enough, we're literally going to undermine our own self-esteem, and we're going to erode what's left of our self-confidence. This leads us to seeing ourselves as failure. You know, you got to remember this. Doubt, fear, and inferiority are amplifiers. They amplify and they elevate feelings of failure and rejection, making them seem bigger than they really are. Because when you and I forget that we are unique, that we are one of a kind, and we start comparing and contrasting ourselves to other people, our inner critic, that nagging little voice between our ears, grabs a hold of those failure thoughts and continues to remind us over and over again of all the times we failed in the past, all the times we've tried to succeed but didn't quite get there. So if we don't learn to reject that inner voice, here's what can happen. We can find ourselves paralyzed, unwilling to take a risk, to try again, and at that point, we stop advancing toward our goals. But you got to remember, it's not just negative thinking. It's not just a poor attitude. It's not just wrong opinions. It's not just limiting beliefs. It's not just past failures that can infect our lives. Toxic people can also infect us with the suds. I mean, think around it. Being around people who have a negative outlook, being around people that want to mock and ridicule who we are and what we do, or being around people who have embraced failure as their lot in life, those individuals can also add fuel to the fire that our inner critic uses to invoke feelings of inadequacy or feelings of lack. And like a virus, those individuals can infect our lives. And when we allow them to do so, what happens? It impedes our growth and it holds us back from reaching our full potential. Now, Patrick's insistence on his own crazy treatment using plugs to plug up SpongeBob literally prevented him from getting the proper medical care he needed to make a full recovery. So sometimes, probably a lot of the time, you and I need to stop listening to the Patricks and the negative, obnoxious Squidwards that are in our lives that only want to put us down, hold us back, and prevent us from moving forward. But let's go back to the episode. In the cartoon, when Sandy finally got SpongeBob to go to the hospital, he was finally properly evaluated by a doctor, someone qualified to identify exactly what was wrong and prescribe a proper course of action so his malady, his symptoms, his situation could be remedied. Now, the doctor's prescription was simple but effective. So, to remove the Suds, SpongeBob had to go through a purging process. And it was through this purging process that soapy, sudsy residue that filled his body was ultimately removed. Now, free of the Suds, SpongeBob found himself what? Filled with new life, a renewed sense of purpose, and once again, he discovered that he was useful and productive in the service of other people. SpongeBob went through a process in that episode that you and I all must go through if we want to rid our lives of the Suds that are holding us back from rising to become the best version of ourselves. SpongeBob did 3 things, actually 4. Let me give those to you. Number 1, he had to own it. SpongeBob had to admit he had a problem. Number 2, he had to evaluate it. He had to recognize the cause of what brought about the Suds, and he had to go about seeking a cure. Third, he had to treat it. SpongeBob had to go see someone qualified, and that individual took him through a process of removing those impurities from his life, and he needed the help of someone else to do that. It wasn't something he could do by himself. And fourth, he had to avoid it. To keep from getting the Suds again, SpongeBob had to put himself in a position so he could not be reinfected. Now, that very same simple 4-part process holds true for you and me if we find ourselves infected with the Suds. Now, in the cartoon, the proper sponge treatment was the cure. Now, this involved using SpongeBob's natural strength. He was an absorbent, cleansing sponge. And by utilizing his qualities, Hans was able to wring out and utilize the excessive soap and bubbles to actually serve other people. Well, we can use this very same principle in our own lives by using the strengths within us, our black belt leader within, to overcome a case of the Suds. And let me tell you how we do it. First, we've got to be honest with ourselves, and we've got to admit that we've come down with a case of the Suds. You got to remember, denial isn't a cure. Denial is a lie. So we've got to own the fact that at this moment, maybe we're not at our best, and we are now dealing with the Suds. But when we own it, that's step 1 to overcoming the problem, the issue, the situation we find ourselves in at the moment. When we own it, that creates a clear starting point for change. It fosters a strong sense of self-respect and integrity. Why? Because we're taking ownership of the problem. Remember this, admitting we've got a problem ends denial. And you and I cannot fix what we will not acknowledge. That was good. I want to say that again. Admitting we've got a problem ends denial. You and I, we can't fix what we refuse to acknowledge. Now, the second thing we've got to do is we've got to challenge our negative self-talk. When that inner critic begins to pipe up, that nagging voice between our ears, we've got to challenge the claims that inner critic is making. How do we do that? We do that by reminding ourselves, not of our past failures, but of our past achievements. We reframe our failures, those negative thoughts, as learning opportunities. And we begin to build ourselves up with positive affirmations, speaking to our value and our worth. Because when we evaluate where that negative voice is coming from, and we recognize that it's that nagging, lying little voice that only wants to hold us back, we're now in a position to not only recognize the cause, but to realize that we need to seek a cure. Now, the third thing we need to do is we need to focus on action, and we need to reframe failure as a lesson to be learned. So rather than focusing our attention on that nagging little voice telling us what we can't do, we need to focus our energy and our efforts on the actions that you and I can take right now today to move ourselves forward, even if it's only one small little step in a positive direction. You got to remember that inner critic, that nagging little voice wants to focus on our failed outcomes of the past and keep us captive to what happened months and years and sometimes decades ago. But when you and I focus on what we can do today, guess what? We start making small, consistent steps that begins to move us toward our goals once again. And as we do that, one step leads to another, to another, to another, and we begin to build momentum and the motivation to keep going. Remember what Lao Tzu said, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. And if you and I have stopped somewhere along the way because of a case of the Suds, guess what? A single step, one single step restarts the journey, and each new step gets us closer to the goal that we had been pursuing and we stopped and we're now pursuing again. Also important to remember that we need to reframe failure as a lesson to be learned. Because when we do that, what are we doing? We're embracing a growth mindset. And this is going to allow us to see any mistake that we make as an opportunity to learn. It also helps us stop seeing ourselves as failures, but realizing failure is only a moment in time. We're only a failure if we stay in that moment. But when we reframe a mistake as a learning opportunity, we realize it's something we can learn from and we can improve. And that allows us to shift our thinking from negative to positive. I mean, think about the successful people who came before us. What did they do? They failed their way to success. You know, one of my favorite quotes of Henry Ford, and I believe he said it well, is this. He said, failure is the opportunity to begin again, but this time more intelligently. Now, the last thing we've got to do to be able to overcome a case of the Suds is we've got to curate an environment of success. That means we've got to surround ourselves not with negative people, but we've got to surround ourselves with positive people who are going to uplift us, who are going to encourage us, who are going to challenge us and hold us accountable, but do so in a positive way. We need less Patricks in our lives, and we need more Sandy Cheeks in our lives. The people who are going to see the best in us, who are going to speak encouraging words into us, and who are going to work alongside of us to help us cultivate our own unique black belt leader within. You and I, we need to avoid spending time with toxic and negative people because what do? They drain our energy, they sap our strength, and they make us doubt our ability and our potential. We want to limit our time with Patricks who, although they mean well, can hinder our personal growth, they can increase our stress, and they can actually make things worse because they are unequipped and unqualified to help us move forward. So to cultivate an environment of success so we don't go back to the Suds, one other thing we've got to do. We've got to engage in taking vitamins so we don't get sick again. So how do we do that in the personal growth space? Well, I think you probably figured it out. You do what you're doing right now. You listen to personal growth podcasts like Black Belt Leadership. You read personal growth books like the books I've written and other personal growth experts around the world that are sharing their own personal growth stories. These books, these podcasts, these lessons that we can learn like vitamins are going to feed our thoughts with positivity and with potential. As we engage in reading books and engage in listening to personal growth podcasts, those things are going to give us the essential nutrients that you and I need to build a healthy, flexible, positive, creative, growth-focused, resilient mindset. Now, personal growth content in and of itself is going to do one important thing. It's going to provide us with a daily dose of perspective. It's also going to help us cultivate new and innovative ways of thinking so we're constantly stretching the quality of our thinking, and it's also going to expand our knowledge base. And when we can expand our knowledge and determine the right way to use it, that's where wisdom comes from. And as we do those things, improve our perspective, cultivate new and innovative ways of thinking, and expand our knowledge base, we're boosting our mental immunity. We're stimulating the production of positive mindset antibodies that are going to help us recognize and ward off future strains of the Suds. So let me leave you with this. SpongeBob learned a very valuable lesson at the end of the episode, The Suds. And it's a simple but powerful lesson that you and I need to learn and embrace as well. Here's the lesson. The world wants the best version of you to keep showing up, but you can't do that when you've got the suds. Let me say that again. The world wants the very best version of you to keep showing up every single day, but you can't do that when you've got the suds. So let me give you one more piece of advice as we wrap up today's teaching, and that's this. If you think you've got the suds, don't let Patrick be your doctor. I'm Dr. John Terry, the Black Belt Leader. Thanks for joining me. Have a great day.